I think that this transgressive behavior that you're describing is part of the all-out assault on Western categories of thought. And I think that was started not even so much by the Marxists as by the French intellectuals of the late 1960s, especially Jacques Derrida, who maybe is the most dangerous person of the last 40 years. He basically has made the claim that thought itself is an agent of oppression.
Maggots don't make corpses. They feed on them.
And that's absurd, except that he's the dominant thinker.
Yeah.
And I don't think I know people don't understand how radical and transgressive the universities actually are and how deeply embedded this sort of thinking is in them. And this gender issue is a screen as far as I'm concerned.
Gender issues are a smokescreen, Professor Peterson? I disagree.
And it's a screen which is why it's got so much attention. It's a screen for an all-out assault, and that assault started back in the late 60s. It started when the Marxists transformed themselves into postmodernists.
Before we begin, I'd like to thank our patrons and supporters for enabling us to offer our content for free. Our supporters are the reason we have a fighting chance. So if you love our content, think we can make a real difference, and you're not currently supporting, I'd like you to ask yourself why, and send the answers to why@feedthebadger.com. That's why@feedthebadger.com. And if you ask yourself why you don't support us, and the answer is, well, why not? I'll be giving you an option to support at the end of this video. I haven't watched or read everything Professor Peterson has produced. So if he's updated his opinion on gender issues being just a smokescreen since the time that he said this, please inform me in the comments below. All right, let's get down to business. Professor Peterson, you've spoken before about how Christian values underpin our secular democracy. And you're right, they do. But where did those values come from?
Christianity began its life in the social values of Rome's founding families. For example,
Christian emphasis on morality being innate to the individual rather than mediated by tribal affiliation. A lie is a lie, regardless of who you tell it to, even if you tell that lie to someone outside your tribe. In fact, Western systems of secular democracy, in particular the British and then the American system with its emphasis on checks and balances, owes more to Roman politics and Roman character than any other.
It was a democratic republic, with an emphasis on a never-before-seen type of egalitarianism. First, the patricians formed a senate when the king was deposed, then the more numerous plebeians formed the People's Assembly to provide checks on the power of the Senate. And then men of the even more numerous head count started to gain political power as well. There was an overall trajectory in Rome to regard all men as equal and equally deserving of a say in politics. In other kingdoms of the time, the order of the day was for a strong man to kill off his rivals and rule, leaving behind no one who would challenge his right to the throne, surrounding himself by eunuchs and sycophants. That man represented only himself and his dominance over other men. This practice of disposing your rivals was just accepted. Not just accepted, but expected. In Rome, you were supposed to defeat your rivals on the strength of your ideas, your personal charisma, and your words, and your integrity. Although Romans accepted the idea of a man who was first among equals, that man was seen as stronger for his rivals as much as his supporters. The Roman symbol of power was the fasces, a bundle of birch sticks surrounding a single-bladed axe. It symbolized the strength of the many over the one. When a magistrate was outside the boundary of Rome, the axe was bladed. Inside it, the blade was removed, recognizing that his power over life and death was invested back in the people of Rome. So the fasces represented not just the power of many in one, but also that the one had no power without the many.
Rome maintained this uniquely high degree of cooperation between men through civil institutions, a rich mythology of political anecdotes taught by mothers to their sons, and traditions conferring manhood on Roman youths by the virtue of their biological features they shared with other men. But there is one thing in particular that enabled this high degree of cohesion and cooperation: a founding mythology that taught the Roman matron a commitment not to shame her men into games of let's you and him fight. According to anthropologists, cooperative relationships between male humans is one of the features that defines humans as separate from other species, the other being a high degree of parental investment in offspring. Not only did cooperation between men elevate us up from our hominid ancestors, the only time society can pivot from one social structure to another is when men are at their highest level of cooperation with each other. That's the only time we can build new civil institutions, because civil institutions are rules and limitations on men's competition, built cooperatively. And the only time that men are at their highest levels of cooperation is when women allow them to be so, when women have committed to self-mastery and refuse to draw the lines of shame between men. Civilization comes out of cooperative relationships between men, but women decide when and where men cooperate. And these decisions by women drive the course of human history.
The Republic of Rome is our template and ideal for civic life. It remains an aspiration. We still live in its shadow, still using its institutions. When we want a code to live by and a standard to live up to, what do we write it in?
That's right. Latin. Even now. Political expedience and land reform eventually meant Rome regressed back to investing authority into one man in order to maintain stability. The Republic became an empire, and once again the archaic authoritarian values of the single strong man were embraced. The essential egalitarianism of Rome had to go somewhere, so it went underground, into an underground religion. All men are one in God. As Rome embraced more and more archaic authoritarianism to stabilize itself, its old values were stamped into this religion. People appealed to a higher authority than man to keep their cherished beliefs. Like a terracotta mold, when the Roman Empire had cannibalized itself, its political system slumped into irrelevancy and broke away, leaving this newly minted religious force, the Church. For generations upon generations, the Church used spiritual belief to imprint the social values that enabled egalitarian democratic republics to exist on a less enlightened populace. Even though the software being run during the Middle Ages was less complex and less egalitarian, the Church, Christian women, still taught the hardware, generation after generation punching out underclocked CPUs. Until one day, lightning struck, and we started to redevelop the complex software that social hardware was always intended to run. Secular democracy and republics flourished once again. And then, just like Rome, we became the victims of our own success. Unencumbered by aversion to the material that was rife during early Iron Age science, we embraced material science, thus eroded the spiritual basis for our Christian faith. Our social hardware was in jeopardy. So we developed a stopgap, something to fill the void. Charles Fourier's feminism. Without God, Fourier proposed that societies be judged morally by their benefit to women instead. This was already written into the Christian scripture with its commandment that men love their wives as Christ loved the church and sacrificed for it. Fourier simply recognized the already existing spiritual imperative and codified it into a secular philosophy that did not need a God, just when we needed something to replace God. And then that moral framework consumed Marxism and evolved into the following: class warfare between men and women, with men always winning. This is why feminism is everywhere. In every institution, be they academic, government, or media, it's everywhere because it has filled the void made by the beliefs we abandoned. It's a way of maintaining the moral superstructure that we need to run our complex society in the face of the death of God. The only problem is, feminism doesn't work. Roman men achieved unheard of levels of cooperation because Roman women actively chose not to shame them, chose to draw the lines of cooperation between men wider than ever before conceived. Christian values are a reflection of the values developed in the crucible of that cooperation. Now we have a large body of women believing the social hardware they are responsible for creating and perpetuating actively oppresses them, either now or in the past. Shame spurs men to competition with each other, but that competition has to be contained with an overarching cooperative superstructure, or it spills out and eradicates order. Due to feminism, our society encourages no cooperative relationship between men. In fact, it regards such cooperation as sinful, explicitly calling men cooperating and helping each other its version of the great Satan. Men used to be able to cooperate in service of being women's providers and protectors, and adventurers and everything else that men did to ensure progress and prosperity. But after Fourier's feminism combined with Marxism, men cooperating with each other creates patriarchy, and patriarchy oppresses women. Therefore, everywhere that men cooperate must be destroyed. Using the narrative of patriarchy, feminism spurs men to compete in destroying their own cooperative superstructure. Where do you think the postmodernism is coming from? Our social fabric is unraveling, and it's unraveling because women, like Odysseus's Penelope, are actively tearing apart their weaving. Odysseus has come home, but due to feminism, Penelope doesn't recognize him. She sees him as a villain attempting to ravish her, and so she's stuck in a mournful cycle, tearing apart her weaving every night, no ability to accept him, and with no end, because it's all in her own mind. How many women in the world actually understand the role they play in ensuring society's hardware functions? And how many of those women are in the West? And how many of the women in the West believe that class warfare between men and women, with men winning, is true? Maybe not in their current culture, but definitely in their own past cultural traditions. You know, the ones that enabled us to enjoy a stable society. How many millions, billions of Penelopes are there? Not just tearing up their weaving in the West, but smashing their looms, gathering them up for a bonfire, and dancing naked around them while free-bleeding. Right now, we're one bad harvest from extinction, one economic crash from disaster, and how long will the world keep faith in a dollar backed by a country experiencing endless social and political upheaval from all those Penelopes tearing it down? Quite simply, we're at the point where social hardware, the social hardware we inherited from Rome, can't cope. And our fix has driven Penelope mad enough to start tearing it down even faster. The mass of aimless young men subsisting off of porn and games in their parents' basements are not the ones creating this problem. They're the victims of all this. They've been told to be women's breadwinners, then told the product of their service, a system in which they achieve and earn as instructed, is oppressive to women. And we shame them, and we shame them, and we shame them, and we shame them some more. We shame them from the left, we shame them from the right, we shame them from up, we shame them from down, we shame them for going forward, we shame them for going back. Heap that shame on. God knows that won't inspire them into rioting based on simplistic narratives in which they can ease their shame by playing the hero for black people, or women, or communism, or pet rocks, or whatever else they can take the place of the damsel to save. Let's build that head of shame till every single young man throws himself into the fray to play the hero. That'll solve the problem of young men throwing themselves into the fray. Young men don't need to sort themselves out right now. Older men do, and so do women. We need to sort out what we're telling them, and we need to do it quickly. Remember when I said that Roman secular values, the values that underpin an egalitarian democratic republic, were forged by social customs that encouraged high degrees of cooperation between men? Civilization only pivots when men are at their highest level of cooperation. Our solution, therefore, is not to look back at hardware that simply can't do what we're asking for, but to recreate the conditions that made Rome Rome in the first place. If we, for a change, stop tearing young men apart mentally with shame, stop making them play our let's you and him fight games, if we build for them a foundation of cooperation, those young men will reward us all by building the cooperative civic institutions that will usher us into a new age. Because, as Rome recognized way back when, by celebrating biological masculinity, and anthropologists are only just now beginning to catch up to, that's young men's innate nature. It's young men's innate nature. It's their nature to cooperate, to create elaborate systems of overarching cooperation that seamlessly combine cooperation and competition. Look at sports. Look at how often young men invent new sports. Look at the Christmas truce of 1914. Even in the depth of a conflict forced on them, young men tried to reach out and cooperate with the enemy. If you left foreign policy to young men, they'd decide everything over a game of Halo. It's the failure of older men and women when young men are in violent conflict. There are older men trying to ease younger men's burden of shame. And there are women trying to help ease that burden too, and trying to get through to all of our mad Penelopes. They all belong to one particularly stigmatized group. It's men's rights activists. This is a simple mechanical truth, as simple as fluid dynamics. We need to build a new CPU. We need to go back to the drawing board. We need to understand how our Roman CPU was built in the first place, recreate those conditions and do it again. Better, faster, sexier. The most valuable person alive today is the young man living in his parents' basement. He still has the last vestiges of the social hardware of Rome, but no investment in our failing society. When someone figures out how to put in place the right conditions and light a fire under that young man's ass, you will see exponential growth, positive change, the kind of change and growth that builds civilizations. But light a fire in those young men in the wrong conditions? They'll keep saving Penelope so she can keep tearing apart her weaving, and we'll go just as fast downward in a death spiral no one walks away from. If we get through this, our descendants will look back at this time and boggle at the idea that anyone wanted to stay in the Dark Ages, because this is a Dark Age. No one ever knows they're in a Dark Age, because Dark Ages are always judged by what comes next. Free the young men from their prison of shame, and we'll see what comes next. Don't, and everybody knows what comes next. So here we are at the end of the video. As promised, here's an option to support, and now you can watch me attempt to try to get my finger there. All right. No, oh. I know our message is not one that's easy to digest, but it's a needed one. Our young men are not responsible for any of this. They're being expected to lift a weight they can't lift. They can't choose to turn away from games of let's you and him fight when their elders and their goddesses are telling them that that's their identity. Go be a hero. It's your only worth. The way we untangle this knot is to first and foremost stop pulling it tighter. Stop shaming young men for fleeing into the only places where they can enjoy cooperative competition anymore. Stop shaming young men for shutting down under abusive double binds like being told to be breadwinners for women, and then being told being breadwinners for women hurts women. Let's all, us women and older men, let's all take a collective step back and a deep breath and ask ourselves, is this really necessary? Is it necessary to keep heaping on the shame, to keep whipping their backs with switches, to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and then getting surprised and upset when they disappear into porn and games? Let me reiterate, ambition, risk-taking, daring do, and most importantly, cooperation in all its endless variations of cooperative competition are innate to young men. These behaviors are innate. If young men aren't demonstrating them, it's not a flaw in them, it's not petulance or laziness. It's because old men and women have failed to give young men hope and have shut them down with shame. I mean, think about it. They got us this far and then suddenly just stopped for no reason and started killing themselves. Let's not do that. Let's not shut young men down with shame. In fact, let's actively come together and push back against the people who do shut young men down with shame. And if you'd like to support a group that's spreading that message and support us in pushing back against the shame, here it is again. www.feedthebadger.com. Support us and let's get this right. I'd like to thank our patron, Malworth, a scholar of history who offered some criticisms for my first draft of this piece, as well as all of the other patrons who contributed to the creation of this rebuttal, either by offering their thoughts or by being a sounding board so I could practice. Thank you.
When they finally realized after decades of denial that their working class utopias in the Soviet Union, for example, were absolutely murderous and reprehensible empires, they transferred their thinking to identity politics and carried on their merry way.